Back when I was 22, I landed a job at a trendy clothing store in downtown Chicago. It was my first real gig after college, and I was thrilled to be working in the heart of the city. The store was located on Michigan Avenue, right in the Magnificent Mile. I loved the energy of the place, always bustling with tourists and locals alike. At first, everything was great. I enjoyed helping customers find the perfect outfits, and I even got a sweet employee discount. My coworkers were cool, and we'd often grab drinks after our shifts at a nearby bar. Life felt pretty good. But then this guy started showing up at the store. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lots of people would come in regularly, especially during lunch hours when office workers would browse to kill time. This guy, though, he was different. He was probably in his mid-30s, always dressed in dark clothes that looked a bit too warm for the weather. He had this intense look in his eyes that made me uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off. I mean, you can't judge a book by its cover, right? The first few times he came in, I tried to help him like any other customer. I'd ask if he needed assistance, but he'd always mumble something about just looking. That's when I started noticing his pattern. He'd come in, pretend to browse the men's section for a while, but his eyes would always be on me. I mentioned it to my manager, but she just shrugged it off. She said as long as he wasn't causing trouble, we couldn't do anything. I tried to ignore him, focusing on other customers and my work. Weeks went by, and he kept coming in. Almost every day, like clockwork. He never bought anything, just lingered. Sometimes he'd pick up a shirt or a pair of jeans, holding them up as if considering them, but his gaze would always drift back to me. I started feeling anxious every time I had to work. The store that I once loved now felt like a trap. I'd find excuses to stay in the back room, asking my coworkers to cover the floor. They noticed something was off, but I was too embarrassed to explain. I mean, how do you tell someone you're scared of a customer who hasn't actually done anything? One day, after a particularly stressful shift where the guy had stayed in the store for almost 3 hours, I decided to change up my routine. Instead of taking my usual route home, the red line from Grand Station to Fullerton, I decided to walk a few blocks over to the Washington Wells Station and take the Brown line. As I was walking, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The streets were busy with the usual after-work crowd, but I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. When I got to the station, I breathed a sigh of relief. I thought I'd managed to lose him if he had been following me. I was standing on the platform, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the stress of the day. That's when I felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned around and my heart nearly stopped. There he was, at the other end of the platform, staring right at me with a smile on his face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculated. I froze, not knowing what to do. Should I run? Should I scream? But he hadn't actually done anything, had he? The train arrived, and without thinking, I jumped on. It wasn't my line, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. As the doors closed, I saw him still standing there, that eerie smile never leaving his face. I got off at the next stop, my hands shaking as I called a Lyft to take me home. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the moment on the platform in my head, wondering if I was overreacting or if I was in real danger. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing him again. My manager wasn't happy, but I didn't care. I spent the day in my apartment, jumping at every little noise. When I finally went back to work, he was there. Same routine, same staring. I tried to act normal, but inside I was a mess. I started seeing him everywhere, or at least I thought I did. A glimpse of a dark jacket in a crowd, a familiar silhouette across the street. Was he really there, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I changed up my routine completely. I take different routes home every day, sometimes walking, sometimes taking the bus, other times calling a ride. But no matter what I did, I'd see him. Outside my apartment building, pretending to read a newspaper. At the Jewel Osco, where I did my grocery shopping, seemingly comparing prices on canned goods. Even when I went for my weekend jog along the lakefront trail, I'd spot him in the distance, always watching. My friends noticed the change in me. I stopped going out, always making excuses. When they'd come over, I'd triple-check the locks. They tried to get me to open up, but how could I explain? I felt like I was losing my mind. After a particularly bad week where I swore I saw him every single day, I decided to go to the police. I went to the 18th District Station on Larrabee Street, hoping they'd be able to help. I poured out my story to the officer at the desk, my words tumbling out in a rush. But as I talked, I could see the skepticism in the officer's eyes. He listened patiently, then explained that without any direct threats or actions, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I document any further incidents and come back if the man actually approached me or did anything threatening. I left the station feeling defeated and more alone than ever. It seemed like no one was taking me seriously. Was I overreacting? Was this all in my head? I tried to go back to normal life. I kept working at the store, kept my head down, and tried to ignore the man's presence. But the fear never went away. It was always there, a constant knot in my stomach, a tremor in my hands. One evening, after closing the store, I walked home, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got to my apartment building, my heart nearly stopped. There, taped to my door, was a plain white envelope. With shaking hands, I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words. I know where you live. That was it. The final straw. I ran inside, slammed the door, and burst into tears. All the fear, all the stress of the past months came pouring out. When I finally calmed down, I knew what I had to do. I called my parents, who lived in Milwaukee, and told them everything. They were horrified and insisted I come home immediately. That night, I packed up everything I could fit into my car. I left a note for my roommate, promising to explain everything later, and drove straight to Milwaukee. The next day, I called my manager and quit my job. I knew it was unprofessional, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to that store, to that city. I stayed with my parents for a few weeks, jumping at every sound, constantly looking over my shoulder. Eventually, I found a job in Milwaukee and started to rebuild my life. It took a long time before I felt safe again, before I could walk down a street without constantly checking behind me. I never saw the man again, but the experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. Looking back, I still don't know if I overreacted or if I was truly in danger. But I know that trusting my instincts potentially saved me from a worse fate. I learned the hard way that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that blend in with the crowd, the ones that society tells us we can't do anything about until it's too late. It all started during my sophomore year at San Francisco State University. I was majoring in photography, and like most aspiring artists, I was eager to build my portfolio and gain experience. San Francisco was the perfect backdrop for my art. The city's diverse architecture, from the iconic Golden Gate Bridge to the colorful Victorian houses, provided endless inspiration. I spent my weekends exploring different neighborhoods, capturing the essence of the city through my lens. One crisp autumn day, I decided to set up a small online portfolio to showcase my work. Nothing fancy, just a simple website with some of my best shots. I included landscapes of the misty mornings at Land's End, candid street photography from the bustling Mission District, and abstract close-ups of the intricate details on the cable cars. A few weeks after launching my site, I received an email from a guy named Mark. He said he came across my portfolio and was impressed with my work. Mark explained that he was a local entrepreneur looking for some professional headshots for his business website and social media profiles. He asked if I'd be interested in doing a photo shoot for him. I was thrilled. This was my first potential paid gig, and I couldn't believe someone actually wanted to hire me based on my portfolio. We exchanged a few emails discussing his vision for the photos and my rates. Everything seemed professional and above board. We agreed to meet at Golden Gate Park for the shoot. I suggested the park because it offered a variety of backdrops, from natural settings to more urban areas, without the need for any special permits. Plus, it was a public place, which seemed safer for a first-time client meeting. The day of the shoot arrived, and I packed my gear with excitement. I double-checked my camera, lenses, and even brought along a reflector for better lighting. I arrived at the park early, setting up near the Conservatory of Flowers. The Victorian greenhouse would make for a stunning background, I thought. Mark showed up right on time. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and an easy smile. At first, everything seemed normal. We chatted about the types of shots he wanted, and I started taking some test photos to check the lighting. As we moved around the park, trying different locations, I noticed Mark becoming more talkative. He asked about my photography, complimenting my eye for detail. I was flattered at first. It's always nice to have your work appreciated. But then his comments started to shift. He began talking about how he liked the way I captured things, how I had a unique perspective. It was the way he said it that made me uncomfortable. His tone was almost possessive. I tried to keep things professional, focusing on getting the shots he needed. We moved to the rose garden, and as I was adjusting my camera settings, Mark made a comment about my eyes. He said they were different and that he'd love to photograph them sometime. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. I told myself he was just being friendly, maybe a bit socially awkward. After all, lots of creative types can be a little odd, right? We wrapped up the shoot after a couple of hours. I was relieved when it was over, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling Mark had left me with. I promised to have the edited photos ready within a week and headed home. Over the next few days, I worked on editing Mark's photos. As I looked at them on my computer screen, I found myself scrutinizing his expression in each shot. There was something in his eyes that I hadn't noticed during the shoot, an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I finished the edits and sent them to Mark via email, along with an invoice for my services. I hoped that would be the end of our interaction, but it wasn't. Mark emailed back almost immediately. He gushed about how much he loved the photos, saying I had a real talent for capturing the essence of a person. Then he asked if I'd be interested in doing another shoot. This time, he wanted something more artistic and offered to pay double my usual rate. I politely declined, saying I was too busy with school projects. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have a lot of coursework, but the truth was, I didn't want to see Mark again. He didn't take the hint. Over the next week, I received several more emails from him. Each one became more insistent, offering more money, suggesting different types of shoots. In one, he even proposed we hang out sometime, no photography involved. I started to feel overwhelmed. I tried ignoring the emails, hoping he'd get the message, but they kept coming. Finally, I wrote back, firmly stating that I wasn't available for any more work, and asking him to stop contacting. His response was unsettling. He apologized for being too enthusiastic, but said he felt we had a special connection and didn't want to lose touch. That was when I decided to block his email address. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, I was studying at my favorite cafe in the Haight when I got that prickly feeling on the back of my neck. I looked up from my textbook, and there was Mark sitting a few tables away, pretending to read a newspaper. When he saw me notice him, he smiled and waved as if we were old friends. I packed up my things and left immediately, my heart racing. It had to be a coincidence, right? The Haight was a popular area, after all. But then it happened again. I was at the campus library, working on a paper, when I spotted Mark browsing the photography section. He didn't approach me, but I could feel his eyes on me. I started seeing him everywhere. At the grocery store near my apartment, at the bus stop I used every day, even at Ocean Beach where I like to go for sunset photos. Each time he'd act like it was a happy accident, greeting me with that same unsettling smile. I became paranoid. I changed my routines, took different routes to school, stopped going to my usual hangouts. But somehow he always seemed to find me. I confided in my roommate, Sarah. She was concerned and suggested I report it to the campus police. I was hesitant. After all, Mark hadn't actually done anything illegal. He was just there. Always there. But Sarah insisted, so I went to the campus police office. The officer I spoke to was sympathetic, but said that without any direct threats, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I document every incident and come back if Mark's behavior escalated. I felt helpless. I started carrying pepper spray and became hypervigilant everywhere I went. My photography suffered. I was too scared to go out and shoot, worried I'd run into Mark. Then came the package. It arrived at my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. A plain brown box with my name and address, handwritten on the label. No return address. I hadn't ordered anything, and my birthday was months away. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside was a photo album. My heart sank as I flipped through the pages. Every single photo was of me walking to class, me buying coffee, me sitting on a bench in Golden Gate Park adjusting my camera, all taken without my knowledge. Some were from months ago, others from just last week. The final page had a handwritten note. I hope you like my photography as much as I like yours. I dropped the album as if it had burned me. Sarah found me crying on the floor when she got home. Through sobs, I explained what had happened. She immediately called the police. This time, they took it seriously. The photo album was clear evidence of stalking. They took my statement and the album as evidence. They asked for a description of Mark and any information I had about him. The next day, I went to the courthouse to file for a restraining order. The process was daunting, but the court clerk was kind and helpful. She explained each step, helped me fill out the forms, and assured me I was doing the right thing. The hearing was set for the following week. In the meantime, the police increased patrols in my neighborhood. Sarah insisted on accompanying me everywhere. My professors were understanding when I explained the situation, allowing me to attend some classes remotely. The day of the hearing arrived. I was a nervous wreck, but Sarah and my parents, who had flown in from out of state, were there to support me. Mark showed up with a lawyer. Seeing him in the courtroom, looking calm and collected, made my skin crawl. I presented my case, showing the judge the emails describing the constant, coincidental meetings and presenting the photo album. My voice shook as I explained how Mark's behavior had affected my life, how I lived in constant fear. Mark's lawyer tried to paint it all as a misunderstanding, claiming Mark was just an enthusiastic photography fan who admired my work. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge granted the restraining order. Mark was ordered to stay at least 100 yards away from me, my home, and the university campus. He was also prohibited from contacting me in any way. As we left the courthouse, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. The restraining order was a piece of paper. Would it really keep me safe? The next few months were hard. Even though I hadn't seen Mark since the hearing, I still felt on edge. I jumped at every unexpected noise, scrutinized every face in a crowd. I started seeing a therapist to help deal with the anxiety and fear. Slowly, though, things began to improve. I started going out more, reclaiming my favorite spots in the city. I picked up my camera again, rediscovering my passion for photography. I never saw Mark again, but the experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I learned to trust my instincts and to speak up when something felt wrong. Today, I'm still in San Francisco, working as a professional photographer. I'm more careful about my online presence and who I work with, but I haven't let the experience dim my love for the art. Every time I look through my viewfinder, I'm reminded of how far I've come and how much I've overcome. When I first moved to Boston for grad school, I was equal parts excited and terrified. I'd lived in a small town in upstate New York my whole life, and Boston felt like a whole new world. The city was huge, bustling, and full of history. I remember standing in front of the brutalist concrete building that housed UMass Boston's College of Science and Mathematics, where I'd be studying for my master's in environmental sciences, feeling like I was at the start of a grand adventure. But reality quickly set in. Boston was expensive, way more than I'd anticipated. My modest savings and the stipend from my teaching assistant position weren't going to cut it if I wanted to live anywhere near campus. So, like many grad students before me, I turned to the internet to find a roommate. I posted an ad on several websites, describing myself as a quiet, studious grad student looking for a similar roommate. I got a few responses, but most were from people who seemed a bit too party-oriented for my taste. Then I got a message from a guy named Alex. Alex seemed perfect on paper. He was a software developer working for a tech startup in Cambridge. He described himself as quiet, clean, and respectful of personal space. We exchanged a few messages, and everything seemed to click. He even offered to show me around the apartment via video chat since I was still in New York. The apartment looked great during the video tour. It was in Somerville, just a short T ride from UMass Boston. 2 bedrooms, a decent-sized living room, and a small but functional kitchen. Alex's room was neat and organized, which I took as a good sign. We agreed on rent and move-in dates, and just like that, I had a place to live in Boston. Moving day arrived, and I packed up my old Honda Civic with everything I owned. The drive from New York to Boston was nerve-wracking. I'd never driven in a city as big as Boston before. But I made it, following the GPS to our apartment in Somerville. Alex was there to greet me when I arrived. He was shorter than I expected, with thick-rimmed glasses and a friendly smile. He helped me carry my boxes up to the 3rd-floor walk-up, chatting about the neighborhood and recommending some local spots. The first few weeks were a blur of orientation sessions, syllabus reviews, and trying to navigate the tangled web of Boston's public transportation. Alex and I didn't see much of each other. He was often at work when I left for class in the morning, and I was usually buried in textbooks by the time he got home. But things seemed fine. Alex was quiet, just as he'd promised. He kept the common areas clean and always washed his dishes promptly. We'd occasionally cross paths in the kitchen or living room, exchanging polite small talk about work or the weather. It wasn't a close friendship, but it was comfortable. Or so I thought. About 2 months into the semester, I started noticing small things that felt odd. At first, it was just little things. I could have sworn I left my favorite mug in the dish rack, but I'd find it in the cabinet. Or I'd come home to find my laptop had been moved slightly on my desk. Each time I brushed it off. I was stressed and sleep-deprived. Surely I was just being forgetful. But then my clothes started going missing. Not whole outfits, just individual items. A sock here, a t-shirt there. I tore apart my room looking for them, convinced I must have misplaced them. I even checked the laundry room in the basement, thinking maybe I'd left something in the dryer. But they were nowhere to be found. I didn't want to accuse Alex. After all, why would a grown man want my ratty old college t-shirts? But a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me something wasn't right. One Saturday morning, I was heading out to meet some classmates at a coffee shop to work on a group project. As I was leaving, Alex asked what I was up to. I told him about the project and mentioned we'd probably be at the coffee shop for most of the day. He nodded and said he'd probably just hang around the apartment, maybe do some coding. The project took longer than expected, and it was late when I got home. The apartment was dark, and I assumed Alex had gone to bed. I was exhausted, so I just brushed my teeth and collapsed into bed without even changing. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented and thirsty. As I blinked away sleep, I realized there was a figure standing in my doorway. My heart nearly stopped. It was Alex, just standing there, watching me sleep. When he realized I was awake, he mumbled something about sleepwalking and quickly left. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I laid there, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just a weird coincidence. But deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. The next morning, I waited until I heard Alex leave for work before I got up. I felt paranoid, but I needed to know if my suspicions were justified. I started looking around the apartment, checking for anything out of place. At first, I didn't find anything. But then, on a hunch, I checked behind the bookshelf in the living room. There, wedged between the shelf and the wall, was a small camera. It was pointed directly at the couch where I often sat to study. My blood ran cold. With shaking hands, I kept searching. I found another camera hidden in a houseplant, aimed at the kitchen table. And then, worst of all, I found one in my own bedroom, cleverly disguised as a smoke detector. I felt violated, angry and terrified all at once. I wanted to confront Alex, to demand answers, but I was also scared of how he might react. Instead, I called a friend from my program, explaining the situation through tears. She insisted I leave immediately and offered to let me stay with her. I packed a bag with some essentials, grabbed my laptop, and left. I went straight to the police station. The officers there took my statement and sent a team to the apartment to collect evidence. They found not just the cameras I had discovered, but several more I had missed. Alex was arrested when he returned home from work. The police found hundreds of hours of footage on his computer, not just of me, but of previous roommates as well. It turned out he had been doing this for years, moving to a new apartment whenever a roommate moved out or grew suspicious. The legal process that followed was long and draining. I had to give statements, attend hearings, and relive the whole ordeal multiple times. But in the end, Alex was convicted. The judge sentenced him to several years in prison and mandated psychological treatment. As for me, I moved in with my classmate temporarily before finding a studio apartment I could just barely afford. It took a long time before I felt safe in my own space again. I installed my own security system and always triple-checked the locks. For months, I would search my new apartment for hidden cameras, even though logically I knew there weren't any. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more guarded. It was hard to trust new people, and the idea of having a roommate again was unthinkable, but I was determined not to let it derail my life or my studies. It all started about 2 years ago, when I moved to Austin for a new job in tech. I was excited about the change of scenery and the opportunity to explore a new city. Austin had always been on my radar, known for its vibrant music scene, amazing food, and outdoor activities. I was particularly drawn to the extensive trail system around Lady Bird Lake, right in the heart of the city. My apartment was in the Zilker neighborhood, just a short walk from the lake. It was a bit pricey, but I justified it by thinking about all the money I'd save on gym memberships. Plus, being able to start my day with a run along the water seemed like the perfect way to adjust to my new life in Texas. At first, everything was great. I'd wake up early, lace up my running shoes, and hit the trail just as the sun was rising. The Ann and Roy Butler hike and bike trail became my go-to route. It was a 10-mile loop around the lake with stunning views of the downtown skyline reflecting off the water. I'd usually do a 5K, sometimes pushing it to 5 miles if I was feeling particularly energetic. The trail was always busy, even in the early morning hours. I'd see the same faces day after day, other joggers, cyclists, people walking their dogs. It felt like I was becoming part of a community, even if we rarely spoke beyond a nod or a quick good morning. About 3 months into my new routine, I started noticing him. At first, it was just a fleeting awareness. A guy who seemed to be running at the same pace as me. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and always wearing a red baseball cap. I didn't think much of it initially. After all, it's a popular trail and lots of people have similar routines. But as the days went by, I realized he was there every single morning, always running just a few yards behind me. If I sped up, he'd speed up. If I slowed down, he'd slow down. It was unsettling, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was using me to pace himself. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I decided to test my theory. One morning, instead of my usual 7 a.m. start, I headed out at 6:30. As I rounded the bend near the Pfluger pedestrian bridge, my heart sank. There he was, in his red cap, keeping pace behind me as if nothing had changed. Still, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was being paranoid. Austin was a safe city, and the trail was always busy. Nothing could happen with so many people around, right? But the feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing day. I started noticing little things. If I stopped to retie my shoelace, he'd stop too, pretending to check his phone or stretch. If I took a water break, he'd suddenly become very interested in the informational signs along the trail. I tried changing up my route. Instead of the lake trail, I'd run through Zilker Park or along Barton Creek Greenbelt. But no matter where I went, he'd be there, always in that red cap, always keeping the same distance behind me. The situation was starting to affect other areas of my life. I was having trouble sleeping, constantly looking over my shoulder when I was out, and struggling to focus at work. My coworkers noticed the change in my demeanor, but I was too embarrassed to explain. How could I tell them I was being stalked by a jogger? I tried to gather evidence. I bought a small, wearable camera and started recording my runs. But the footage was shaky and inconclusive. You could see a figure behind me, but it was impossible to make out any distinguishing features beyond that red cap. One morning, about 2 months into this ordeal, I decided to confront the situation head-on. I was tired of feeling afraid, tired of letting this stranger control my life. So, about halfway through my run near the Lamar Beach at Town Lake Metropolitan Park, I stopped abruptly and turned around. He was there, of course, and for the first time I got a good look at his face. He had piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. When our eyes met, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculating, almost predatory. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I opened my mouth to say something, to confront him, to ask him what he wanted. But before I could get a word out, He turned and sprinted away, disappearing down a side trail. That encounter shook me to my core. I called in sick to work and spent the day huddled in my apartment, jumping at every little noise. I tried to convince myself to go to the police, but what would I tell them? That a guy in a red hat was jogging behind me? They'd laugh me out of the station. The next morning, I was determined not to let fear control me. I got up at my usual time and headed out for my run. But as I stepped out of my apartment building, my blood ran cold. There, tucked under the windshield wiper of my car, was a note. With shaking hands, I unfolded it. 5 words were scrawled in messy handwriting. "See you on the trails." That was it. The final straw. I ran back into my apartment, locked the door, and burst into tears. When I finally calmed down, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't live like this anymore. I called my boss and explained that I had a family emergency and needed to take some time off. Then I started packing. I threw clothes haphazardly into suitcases, not really caring what I took. I just needed to get out. As I was packing, my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, knocked on my door. She had seen me rushing in and out and wanted to make sure everything was okay. Through tears, I explained the situation. She was horrified and insisted on helping me pack and keeping me company until I left. Mrs. Rodriguez's kindness was a bright spot in an otherwise terrifying day. She helped me load up my car and even packed me some sandwiches for the road. As I hugged her goodbye, she made me promise to let her know when I arrived safely at my parents' house in Houston. The drive to Houston was a blur. Every red car I saw made me flinch. Every man in a baseball cap made my heart race. I kept expecting to see him in my rearview mirror, following me out of Austin. When I finally arrived at my parents' house, I broke down again, telling them everything through sobs. They were shocked and angry, insisting that we should go to the police. But I was too scared, too ashamed. I just wanted to forget it had ever happened. I stayed with my parents for a week, barely leaving the house. I kept expecting to see a man in a red cap outside, but he never appeared. Slowly, I started to feel safe again. I called my boss and explained the situation. To my relief, she was incredibly understanding. She even suggested that I transfer to our Houston office if I didn't feel comfortable returning to Austin. I gratefully accepted the offer. Over the next few weeks, I started rebuilding my life in Houston. I found a new apartment not too far from my parents' house. I threw myself into work, grateful for the distraction. But I couldn't bring myself to go running again. The very thought of lacing up my running shoes made me break out in a cold sweat. Instead, I joined a gym. The treadmill wasn't the same as running outdoors, but at least I felt safe, surrounded by other people and security cameras. Slowly, very slowly, I started to feel like myself again. I still run, but now it's on a treadmill at the gym, surrounded by people and security cameras. It's not the same as those morning runs in Austin, but it's something. And each step I take feels like a small victory, a reminder that I'm moving forward, leaving the fear behind me. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.